Is Jack opening or Kristen?
All right, I don't know if we need to open the door to let people in.
It's open.
Excellent, thank you. All right, good, I see people getting in. We're gonna give this a minute or so to let people join. If you are here for the briefing on the Gaza catastrophe, you're in the right place. We're gonna give this another 30 seconds or so for people to join, and then we'll be getting started. So thank you so much for your patience. All right, I want to respect everybody's time. I know people are still joining. We will have a video of this afterwards so people can watch if they missed the introductions. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, and welcome to the fourth and final session of the series, The Gaza Catastrophe, a private briefing for the 118th Congress. I'm Laura Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting the series with Khaled Al-Gindi of the Middle East Institute.
Thanks, Laura. So today's session is called What Comes Next, in which we'll be looking at the prospects for reconstruction and governance in Gaza, as well as the implications of the ongoing crisis for internal Palestinian politics and the future of the Palestinian national movement. To help us better understand these issues, we've put together a really excellent panel of experts. I'm going to list them here in alphabetical order, and you can read their full bios on the webpage for this series. So first we have Abdelhadi Alijl, who is a Palestinian social and political scientist and science advocate. He's an associate researcher and the regional manager of the Varieties of Democracy Institute at Gothenburg University in Stockholm, Sweden. He's also the author of the book Trusted in Divided Societies by Bloomsbury Academics and I.B. Torres in the UK, and co-editor of Rebel Governance in the Middle East. Next, we have Abid is joining us, I believe, from Stockholm. Yeah. Nour Odeh, who is joining us from the West Bank, is an independent media professional and political analyst with 20 years of experience as a journalist as well as in government. In 2012, Ms. Odeh became Palestine's first female government spokesperson, and she served in various capacities as a senior communications and public diplomacy advisor to the Palestinian leadership. Third, we have Mouin Rabbani, who is joining us, I believe, from Yerevan?
Correct.
Yes, okay, so we have a very geographically scattered group. Mouin is a researcher and analyst specializing in the contemporary Middle East. He's co-editor of Jaddaliya Journal and a senior fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies, and holds a number of other affiliations with various scholarly publications and institutions.
Sorry, small correction. I have no relationship with the Institute for Palestine Studies.
Oh, I'm sorry. Apologies for that. Mouin has published, presented, and commented widely on Middle East issues, including for most major global media. Again, you can read their full bios on the landing page for this event. Our colleagues will put links into the chat box. Also, keep an eye on the chat box for Twitter handles and links to articles and other resources relevant to today's discussion. And if you miss anything in the chat box, don't worry, we'll be posting these on the website once the series is complete, or after this event.
And then the last bit of housekeeping, the format for the session, like all the sessions in the series, is going to be a moderated Q&A led by myself and Khaled. We have some basic questions to get things started. We very much welcome your questions to the panelists as well. You can submit those to the Q&A box at any time during the discussion. We'll keep an eye on them. And if there's questions, we will absolutely try to weave them into our own. And then finally, please note this is being recorded. And also, if there are technical problems or questions, put those into the chat box. Thank you very much, and let's begin.
Thanks, Laura. So Abid, I want to start with you. And as someone who is from Gaza and who still has family there, the images, videos, and testimonies coming out of Gaza for the past 7 months have been really heartbreaking and gut-wrenching. And of course, it continues to this very moment. And yet we know that they don't even begin to really capture the full scale and depth of horror and suffering that exists in Gaza today. So I want to ask you to kind of lay this, set the scene for us. Tell us a little bit about what the past 7 months have been like for you and your loved ones in Gaza, and what's been lost in Gaza, and what are the conditions currently on the ground. We know that at least almost 35,000 have been killed, the vast majority of them women and children. This includes a staggering 14,500 children at least. In addition, we know the war has destroyed most of Gaza's civilian infrastructure and institutions that are essential for basic life. So give us a sense of the scale of destruction, the current conditions, what it means for the 2.3 million people who live there, and for Palestinians more broadly.
Thank you, Khalid, for this. I think, as everybody knows, the situation is grim and catastrophic and genocidal in every meaning. For us, I think for the 2.3 million Palestinians, there are also 200 or 300,000 Palestinians live in diaspora who have close relatives first hand. And we cannot also exclude them because the trauma, the continuous trauma that have been going on since the beginning is also exceed the scale of the trauma and the genocidal acts being committed in the Gaza Strip. We can't separate them clinically based on that. But for me, as somebody who is his family from Gaza, I think my family and my extended family as well represent every family in the Gaza Strip. I have siblings. They fled from East Gaza to West Gaza in the first days. And after 10 days, they were asked to evacuate. So I had asked my mother, she didn't want to leave the Gaza city in West Gaza and Tel El Hawa. And then she had to flee to Khan Yunis, and my sisters and brothers lived to Rafah and Khan Yunis. And they started to move. The first time they bombed, the first week they bombed my cousins' houses. They killed the 17 in the house, all of my cousins, their sons, their men, together. And until today, they are not registered as being killed because they are under the rebels. They are one of the 8,000 Palestinians who still uncounted as victims. And after that, they started to attack Khan Yunis. My mother was injured. She's 76 years old. She was exactly born 1 month before the Nakba, before the establishment of the State of Israel. And then she continues to live the Nakba since then. So they had to move to the Zawaida, to the Wusta. One of my nieces was killed in the 1st of November in an attack as well. Later on, my sisters in Rafah moved from Khan Yunis to Rafah, and yesterday and 2 days ago they moved from Rafah to Khan Yunis. So it's a continuous trauma for children, for adults, and for every single person in the Gaza Strip. So in December, the first week of December, 70% of the Palestinians had close relative or their homes were destroyed. But now we are in May 2024. So I think 95% of the Palestinians have lost their homes, like me, myself, my family. We have 2 homes, they completely destroyed. Actually, I was sitting at in my work in January when the Israeli Broadcasting Agency, they were like showing the videos of how they attacking Jaddaliya. When they were shooting at our home, they actually bulldozered our home in Jaddaliya. And For the record, Shujaiya is not like it's not all Hamas to be to give the sense of the people who are attending this, because the Gaza Strip in each family you can have Hamas and you have Fatah, you can have the leftists, you have the communists, you have the conservative. So but the idea of having this trauma, which is always, we have been for the last 70 years, Israelis and Zionists and even American conservatives talking about the trauma of the Jewish population, which is, we accepted this. I mean, we accept, we sympathize, we are humans, but nobody talking about our trauma, our own trauma as Palestinians, as Gaza, and so on. So in general, just so what I call this is a war against the future, a war against the future of the Palestinians in Gaza, deliberate destruction of all universities in Gaza, deliberate destruction of all infrastructure in Gaza, streets, electricity, power plants, deliberate destruction of the healthcare system, and deliberate destruction of private properties. So what is this? Is a deliberate genocidal tactics and a strategic move by Israeli government and Israel to make Gaza uninhabitable and force the population to leave. It's not voluntarily, because once you do this, it's actually forced explosion. And that's exactly what is the situation in Gaza.
Thank you, Abdelhadi. Nour, I want to turn to you and picking up on what Abdelhadi was talking about trauma and since October and even before. I want to look at the West Bank, and you're in Ramallah. I want you to talk about what it's been like for people in the West Bank, both in terms of having to witness the horrors being inflicted on Gaza, and in terms of the stepped up violence and repression from the Israeli army and from settlers in the West Bank. And it's worth reminding people that, where people say, if you talk about before October 7th, you're somehow justifying terror. It's important to note that before October 7th, 2023 was on track to be the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank in a very long time. And immediately before October 7th, we'd seen an uptick in the marauding settlers in parts of the West Bank with death and damage and all of that. Since October 7th, I think close to 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. There's been daily incursions by the army, attacks by settlers. Some people are talking about the possibility of a third intifada. I guess I'd like to ask you if you think that's a real possibility. And also, if you have time or an interest, to talk about where this leaves the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas, and who appear to be politically and effectively neutralized and impotent in the current context.
Well, thank you for having me. And let me just start by painting a picture of the West Bank, which is often, it's easier to imagine it as something being completely separate from Gaza. And I just want to, put it out there that there are, first of all, thousands of Palestinians from Gaza who live in the West Bank. There are thousands others like me who lived in Gaza for many years and consider it home. So the trauma is very real. There are real, there are wakes for loved ones who are lost. There's real worry for friends who are displaced. And then there is the national trauma, the bigger picture trauma of people who are trapped in the Bantustans of the West Bank. Their movement has been curtailed, dramatically since October 7. Movement from one place to another in the West Bank has become extremely difficult and dangerous. I remember the first month, schools went online because it was too dangerous to have kids, go from their homes to school, especially the ones in the villages and areas where the settlers ran amok. Universities for many months, and I think still most of them have kept most of their instruction online because they're afraid that their students, who are basically the prime target of Israeli settlers and the Israeli army, that they would be, sending them into harm's way if they had to commute to the university and back. So every aspect of life has been affected, commercially, economically, all of that. But I think most importantly is the sense of pending doom, the sense that we are next. Things are already happening. Displacement in the West Bank never stopped, but it was always small, in small bites, if you will. And it was always in isolated areas where you can almost, if you wanted to convince yourself that it's far from me, right? I live in Ramallah in my nice little bubble, in my nice little home. And this is just in the, outlying areas of the West Bank. Well, that's no longer the case. You have much bigger communities that are being displaced. If I just walk out to my balcony in Ramallah, I can see the Israeli settlement nearby. I can see the Israeli military camp, Ofer, right outside my window, where hundreds of Palestinian men, women, including abductees from Gaza, are held. And so it is very real, and it is, it gets under your skin, because you know that this is not a reality you're watching. It's one that you're living, and it's one that can visit you and knock on your door, or just blast it open at any minute. And in that sense, I think it has also been a moment of truth for Palestinians who have seen that their political institutions have completely and utterly failed. They have taken themselves out of the equation. They're not only been made impotent or made to look like that, they have chosen to sit on the sidelines in order not to invite the wrath of the United States and other donors. And in that sense, they've taken themselves out of the parentheses in which we are trapped as a people, traumatized collectively, sharing our pain and trying to not necessarily make sense of it, but survive it as an entity, as a people who are spread all over the world, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, knowing that we have different forms of pain, but they're ultimately one part of one experience. And I think that's been one of the more difficult realizations for Palestinians, to know not only that, international politics thinks of them as expendable, but that also their so-called leaders are completely useless. They are added baggage. They are weighing them down instead of lifting them up.
Thanks, Nour. Mouin, I want to come to you next. As an expert on Palestinian politics and history, could you help situate this moment for us historically in the context of the broader Palestinian national struggle? As you all know, next week marks the 76th anniversary of the Nakba, which Abed mentioned is the catastrophe, referring to the destruction of Palestinian Arab society and the dispossession of 2/3 of Palestine's Arab population over the course of Israel's creation in 1948. And yet what is happening now is both deadlier, and in fact is the deadliest moment in Palestinian history. And it's also the largest forced displacement in Palestinian history. For now, they've been mostly displaced within Gaza, but the possibility remains, of course, that they could be displaced outside of Gaza. So is this another Nakba in your view? How is this devastation and the collective trauma that Nour talked about likely to, in your view, to reshape Palestinian politics or political thinking going forward?
Unmute.
I just did. Sorry about that. Thank you, Khaled, and thank you to both Middle East Institute and Foundation for Middle East Peace for inviting me to participate in this session. Several questions, which I'll try to separate. Is this another Nakba? I think my response to that would be, to the question, is this a second Nakba, would be to point out that many Palestinians have for many years been using the phrase ongoing Nakba, denoting a continuous process of land alienation, of dispossession, of displacement, of institutional discrimination, of apartheid that has been ongoing since 1948, and particularly since 1967. And therefore, we see it not only so visibly today in the Gaza Strip, but as Nour pointed out, very much in the West Bank itself, and particularly in East Jerusalem, but of course also within Israel as well. So while referring to it as another Nakba is in one sense perfectly appropriate, it would also, in my view, be mistaken to view the events of the past 7-8 months in isolation from the broader dynamics of Israeli-Palestinian relations over many years, in fact, decades. And those dynamics, I think, also form the crucial context to help understand where we are today. As for the Gaza Strip specifically, and here referring to Abdelhadi's moving introductory comments, the preeminent Palestinian historian Walid al-Khalidi notes that, and he's a stickler for detail, I should add, he notes that more Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip since October than have been killed collectively in the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1948. Now, that can't be without consequences. It can't be without political consequences, and these will be many. They will be local, they will be regional, and they will be global. And I think there will also be political consequences, as many people have pointed out, for the United States, which, particularly given this forum, it needs to be emphasized, is directly complicit in what the International Court of Justice has determined plausibly constitutes a genocide. Regarding your third point, how will it reshape Palestinian politics going forward? Well, even though you could argue that it's premature to draw any definitive conclusions, I think one can already make a number of tentative observations. And ironically, I mean, many of them relate to the law of unintended consequences, given the stated objectives of this war on the Gaza Strip. First, and I'll keep it brief because I think Nour put it quite succinctly, I believe the Palestinian Authority is finished as a force of political significance, as a force of national significance. It has chosen to play the role of powerless spectator, and that's being generous. The future of Fatah, which for decades formed the spinal cord of the Palestinian national movement, it remains mired in an advanced state of disintegration. Its future hangs in the balance. Its survival, in my view, as a meaningful political force, depends on its ability to either lead or participate in a pathway to a new national movement, which would involve not reviving its former hegemony, but integrating Hamas and Islamic Jihad into the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. As for Hamas itself, it stands, in my view, before a historic crossroads. Will it seek to replace one hegemony with another in a bout of triumphalism? And this, in my view, would lead to failure and paralysis. Or will it resist this triumphalism and seek to participate in the construction of a new and genuinely national movement that legitimately represents Palestinians everywhere, including in the diaspora, and includes not only its counterparts, but also rivals who are similarly inclined to build for a better future. And finally, I think there's also a key question here for outside parties, and that question is this: do the Palestinians have the right to select their own leaders and leadership, or will the West continue to insist that these are decisions that will be made for the Palestinians by Israel, by the United States, and by the European Union? Thank you.
Thanks, Mouin. And we're going to dig into some of those questions later on in this conversation. I want to actually stick with you for this next question and ask you to turn. You ended talking about Hamas. I want to turn to the Israel side of this, and as an analyst, since October 7th, Israeli leaders have repeatedly insisted that one of their main objectives, I mean, one objective is releasing hostages, which has been obviously not successful except in the context of negotiations. But the other main objective is the destruction of Hamas as both a military and a governing force. And most analysts from the outset have said that this is not an achievable goal. And your last comment seemed to suggest that you would agree with that. Can you talk more about that, this whole idea of destroying Hamas and why that is not an achievable goal? And assuming that Israel and its analysts knew that, what do you see as Israel's end game in Gaza, even when they're saying it's defeating Hamas? And finally, if you can also situate that a little bit or extrapolate from that to the current moment as we are getting into what appears to be Israel's endgame in Rafah, which I think a lot of us increasingly see as doing what they're always going to do in Rafah, which is a ground invasion and taking it, but doing it now in this drip way instead of a massive single operation, which maybe will dissipate international objections to it. Can you talk about that and the context of Hamas's engagement in ceasefire negotiations and what that is all about and what that means for how Hamas is perceived by Palestinians and by the world?
Yes, thank you, Lara. A lot to unpack there. So let me start with Israel's stated objectives of eliminating Hamas as a movement, eliminating it as a military force, eliminating its ability to govern the Gaza Strip. As far as eradicating Hamas is concerned, this was never realistic for a simple reason, which is that the Gaza Strip may form Hamas's primary stronghold, but in practice, it exists elsewhere too. Arguably, Hamas is to be found wherever significant Palestinian communities are to be found across the region and indeed the globe. So let's look, for example, at the West Bank. Israel has spent years trying to eliminate a much weaker Hamas and Qassam brigades presence in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, it has been doing so hand in glove with the Palestinian Authority. I think many analysts would agree that not only is Hamas in the West Bank today not weakened, but it is arguably stronger. And Hamas in the West Bank is but a shadow of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So the idea that you can succeed in Gaza where you have failed in the West Bank doesn't strike me as entirely logical. Now, even if we were to limit ourselves to a discussion of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Israel has been at it now for more than 7 months. This is the longest war Israel has fought since the late 1940s. And the indications that it is about to eliminate Hamas in the Gaza Strip are, in my view, precisely zero. And so, what hasn't succeeded in 7 months is, in my view, very unlikely to succeed in the next 7 months. I'd now like to briefly address your question about the end game. I think there's Israel's preferred end game, which is that the Gaza Strip is emptied of Palestinians, that the Gaza Strip is made unfit for human habitation, and that if Palestinians are not forced out, they will force themselves out, so to speak. But failing that, I believe that Israel's model for the Gaza Strip is one that it applied to the West Bank during the Second Intifada. In 2002, Israel invaded all the cities in the West Bank that were under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, and that Israel had effectively not entered since the mid-1990s. It broke the back of the Palestinian Authority. It broke the back of the main armed movements in the West Bank. And from 2002 moving forward, it was essentially engaged in low-intensity warfare to try to eliminate or at least transform those movements that still existed into a nuisance rather than a threat. My sense is that this is its model for the West, for its current campaign in the Gaza Strip. Break the back of Hamas so that it no longer represents a significant military threat, and then continue with what are called mopping up operations for the next years or whatever. But it's not a model, I think, that will translate very well to the Gaza Strip for a whole variety of local, regional, and international reasons that I won't get into here. Finally, regarding ceasefire and Rafah, I agree with you, Lara, that Rafah was always on the agenda. And having failed in Gaza City, having failed in Shifa Hospital, having failed in Khan Yunis, now the idea is that if we can only take Rafah, we'll achieve total victory, etc. And when that isn't achieved, Netanyahu will be able to blame the United States for having restrained him. He'll be able to blame the security establishment for having failed in its mission. But Israel, not only Netanyahu, but the Israeli leadership will have succeeded in sowing massive death and in the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure that Abdelhadi spoke about in Rafah as well. And it will also crucially seek to maintain control of the Egyptian-Palestinian border between the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. I didn't address the ceasefire negotiations, but very briefly, I think there's a fundamental contradiction between a ceasefire that leads to an end of Israel's war and the models that Israel sees as an endgame that I briefly discussed.
Thanks, Mouin. Abdelhadi, I want to come back to you. We've talked a little bit about the political divisions in Palestine, particularly the split between Fatah and Hamas, which goes back to 2007. Many people see this split, which of course is part of a broader set of pathologies that exist and dysfunctions in Palestinian political life. But a lot of people see this division as a key driver of instability in Gaza over the past 15 years, and may have even facilitated the current catastrophe that is now unfolding in Gaza. Since October 7th, we've seen some new efforts at reconciliation. I think it's a movie we've all seen many times before. We saw a push in Moscow and more recently in Beijing. But we never seemed to get to any sort of breakthrough. And that was true, obviously, also before October 7th. There seems to be general agreement on the need for some kind of technocratic government, consensus government, it's sometimes referred to, that's agreed to by all the parties, and that can operate in both the West Bank and Gaza. And secondly, there's broad agreement on the need to reform and restructure the PLO, to bring Hamas and these other groups under the PLO umbrella. But again, this never seems to really happen. What is the future of reconciliation? In your view, what part of this split do you think is imposed from the outside? We know that Israel is as a colonial power, believes very much in the old divide and rule rule. And what part of it is self-inflicted by Palestinians themselves? And do you see prospects for reconciliation being improved now in the face of this catastrophe, or is it much harder to achieve?
There's the $1 million question actually to be, but yeah, let me try. Well, I mean, they are here. I mean, the division between Fatah and Hamas, it didn't start in 2007. It started exactly in 2002 when Ghazi Jabbali, the head of the Palestinian police, killed a few Hamas activists inside Islamic University in Gaza. That's when all started. And then those of Alijl, one of them is from Alijl family, they killed Rajah Abu Lihya, the head of Palestinian Special Forces, in 2002. That's before even Abbas, before Yasser Arafat died. So the Hamas-Fatah conflict and division has been there for a long time. But it just in 2007, it was the tipping point that took the world by surprise. It's one of the things that Hamas' problem is that it succeeded in sudden ways. I don't know if it's luck for them. In 2006, they won the election. They didn't want. In 2007, they took over Gaza Strip by Al-Qassam. They didn't want that. Then now with the 7th of October. But here, the division. I don't think that we are moving forward. And we will not move forward because these two parallel lines moving together in the same direction and two different political agendas. And I will explain later why this thing. The Fatah in Gaza Strip has no trust among the people. I mean, there is less than 5% of the Palestinians in Gaza have a trust in Fatah and less than 1% in Abbas himself. Even Fatah members in the Gaza Strip have no trust in Abbas. That's one. This is the camp that represents Fatah now is Abbas and the Sheikh and the head of intelligence. I forgot his name. The Palestinian intelligence agency.
Majid Faraj.
Majid Faraj.
Majid Faraj, exactly. So those the three people that represent the Fatah now in the negotiation. And by the way, it's not China the last one. It was the last week was Doha negotiation under the table as well for reconciliation. And I will come later to this as well. And then Hamas have more trust among the Palestinians in the West Bank, but also because of the grievances so high in the Gaza Strip in the recent 6 months. So many Palestinians who were also against Hamas or disliked Hamas in one way or another, they are moving to be more pro-Hamas. They wanted Hamas agenda. They wanted Hamas alternative for the Palestinian Authority. So here, practically, you are talking about people in Gaza Strip. That's many of them have already ideological reason to disagree with Hamas and condemn Hamas. And there are so many platforms nowadays that give them platform and voice to be as a representative of the Gaza. But this doesn't represent the reality on the ground, to be honest. Because if you have one voice against Hamas now, you have 1,000 another transformed from being against Hamas to be pro-Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So here, and this is exactly go directly rejecting Fatah agenda, rejecting any Fatah and any reconciliation. They don't want Fatah because for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip nowadays, they see betrayal from the Palestinian Authority. If you go down to the streets, so it's like the Kuwaiti doctors came, but we didn't see anyone from Fatah in the West Bank. For example, the Abbas didn't even spoke to the Palestinians only once. The Palestinian Authority haven't even paid salaries of many of the Palestinian Authority employees. The Palestinian Monetary Fund and banks didn't help the Palestinians to smuggle some efforts, including the Kuwaiti, they smuggled cash, which is none. But the Palestinians Authority didn't do anything. Fatah didn't do anything. Fatah in Gaza Strip, all its leaders left Gaza the second month. All of them left Gaza with their families. So here you have this also mirror how the Palestinians in Gaza see. So Hamas have been capitalizing on this now that we have our agenda, we have our political agenda, and they have their agenda. You saw them, we saw them, and you have to decide. So here one thing, but also about this reflect to the trust of Hamas versus Fatah and the Gaza Strip. But then you have the other layer is the institutional layer here. Who is responsible for that? Hamas recently, in the last 2 years, Hamas has accepted technocratic government. They were ready to give full control to the Palestinian Authority with the exception of one thing, security. And if you go down to the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip, they would agree to you that we need Hamas to take over the security because we don't want to go back to the security chaos 2005, 2007, when the Palestinian Authority couldn't do anything. If Hamas done anything, and this is everybody in Gaza Strip agree, even Fatah leaders agree on this. If anything Hamas done is to end security chaos and to have a firm and strict one weapon in Gaza Strip. So here is the idea: is the Palestinian Authority reject this. Mahmoud Abbas personally reject this. Personally. So I want to tell you something, that every Arab leader that have spoken in the last 2 months about reconciliation with Mahmoud Abbas, they came to the conclusion that Mahmoud Abbas is the sole responsible for the current political division between Fatah and Hamas, because he is the one who rejected any attempt of reconciliation with Hamas. Because he put so much conditions on Hamas, including accepting Oslo Accord, literally. Oslo Accord, and he has said it to Emir of Qatar some times ago. And so here you have also the external Arabian leaders, Arab leaders, but also influential like Algeria. They just said, okay, we can't do anything. Like Egyptians now, they securitized the whole Palestinian political division. They don't talk anymore to the political level. They talk only to the intelligence level officers, and even not the head of the intelligence. And that's why I see no probability for political reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas unless there is a political will in Fatah, and if there is a change, real change. And this real change comes with Abbas accept a new realities. He doesn't accept the reality that Hamas is powerful enough to have a word, to be part of the PLO, to be part of the Palestinian mosaic, political mosaic, and he wants to still to control everything in a dictatorial, as a dictator, to be honest, in many ways. But externally, Netanyahu has played a very important role in the last 5 years. He was pushing towards strengthening and deepening the political division. How? One is in every time the Palestinians were close to achieve anything or to unite the bureaucratic administration, he used to either with the Qatari money to Hamas in one way or another. Second, to the 2022 war, 2014 war, but also you have the 2022 escalation in the summer. So there is the tactics in the Israeli government that we need to deepen this division and to keep it as it is, because this is the only way that we can keep the equilibrium, to blame Hamas, to blame the existence of somebody, and so on. But now, and after the 7th of October, after this genocide, things have changed at the public level, with the popular level, Palestinians themselves, the women, the adults, everyone. And it changed also at the level of institutions in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So to go back and to talk on the same narrative that we want to do reconciliation again on the same issues, with the same, to include Hamas and the PLO only without real reform, this doesn't work anymore. And this is not only because of this, but because what has been happening in the last 2 months. The Palestinian Authority has been trying to send some military officer. They took them from Gaza, 150 Palestinian officer, and I'm not talking like just from a news, because we know in reality in Gaza, we know we are all Gaza know each other. To be it's just we know each other. When the Palestinian Intelligence Agency took from Gaza 150 officer, and then tried to send them with the humanitarian aid, and most recently, the Palestinian Authority also informed the Americans that they are ready to take over the Rafah borders. This blow in the face, spitting in the face of the Palestinians in Gaza, to say this behind their back. And the idea is not because they love Hamas or the Palestinians, they prefer Hamas in Gaza. No, it's just because they don't expect anybody to come on the top of a tank to govern them. If you held election tomorrow in Gaza, Hamas may not win, by the way. Seriously, Hamas may not win. But Fatah will not get 5%. That's what I say.
Thank you, Abdelhadi. That was a very, very rich explanation. And I have to say, listening to the discussion about Reconstruction, when Khaled introduced it in the question, the idea that we've seen this movie before, it is striking how much of this sounds so familiar, notwithstanding the fact that the conditions have changed completely. That's part of the part that's almost surreal about your analysis of what's happening. I really appreciate that. Nour, I want to pick up on some of the things that Abdelhadi was talking about and zoom in on the West Bank and also on the political analysis of where this fits in for the PA. So really looking at the Fatah Hamas competition, conventional wisdom it has been that Hamas's popularity has grown. Abdelhadi was talking about that, particularly in the West Bank, where the PA and Fatah, I think, have been having a credibility deficit that has only grown over the past 20 years pretty consistently. But that since October 7th, that credibility has declined. So can you talk about this a little bit more? Abdelhadi talks about it already a lot, but from the West Bank perspective, and what do you think Hamas and the PA will look like as political forces, as organized political forces vying for authority, vying for credibility in the aftermath of October 7th? We keep talking day after, including where the PA is already being positioned in effect to be the chosen arm of the international community. This goes back to something that Mouin said before, do Palestinians get to choose their leadership? And also, maybe this is a little more technical for our audience, but in the midst of all of this, we had a new PA prime minister. The cabinet was appointed last month by President Abbas. It was technocratic, right, mostly. I think it includes 5 of the 23 ministers from Gaza. And as Abdelhadi said, Hamas has become more and more embracing of the idea of technocratic government. And so it was welcomed by Hamas and opposition parties, but it basically has been rejected, by Hamas and opposition parties, embraced by the international community, but by and large, it's been ignored as development. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on how the Palestinian public saw this development. Is it something that we should not be ignoring? And what is this revitalized or quote unquote reformed PA doing? What's it demanding? What's different?
Oh, a lot to unpack. But let me just start by saying that I don't like the word reconciliation, because I think that it betrays what has happened, which is that Palestinian political factions failed their people. So I'm less concerned about Fatah and Hamas kissing and making up, and more concerned about them owning up to their responsibility in where we are at this historical moment, and really beginning to think about how to make it up to the Palestinian people whose back has been broken by this division that is fed and prolonged and entrenched by an international agenda, especially in the West, that has been obsessively involved in trying to to have a monopoly over deciding who's the good Palestinian, right? So in circles in Washington, and I'm speaking from, this is how it looks from our side, right? That in Washington and in European capitals, they try to figure out who is the good Palestinian. And the criteria for that has nothing to do with Palestinians. The criteria for that has to do with whether this person is acceptable to Israel, whether they will accept the humiliating conditions of serving the interests of entrenched occupation, of maintaining the so-called security cooperation, which is unprecedented anywhere else in the world, where the occupied people protect the security of their occupier. This is something unheard of, and it is praised as something groundbreaking and amazing and a roadmap to peace. And this has been an extremely important part of the problem, the fact that Palestinians have been denied agency. We are an educated, vibrant people. You sit on one dinner table in Palestine, and each person will have their own perspective, their own political leaning. We are not a society that can be subdued or, brought into submission to any one ideology. And so even the support for Hamas or Fatah, it's not so much ideological, it's about getting things done. And the central goal for Palestinians is liberation, right? And is resistance, whether it's through whatever means. And right now, when when Palestinians feel that their existence is under threat, armed struggle gains prominence. So Hamas, of course, will gain prominence in the West Bank, where it has had historically a very strong ideological base in the West Bank. In fact, the elections in 2006 couldn't have been won without the West Bank, not Gaza. And this is another one of the many ironies about Palestinian politics. And so now we're again in a place where the West is regurgitating old and failed formulas because this is their comfort zone. Because the starting point of policy in the West is what will serve Israel's interests? What will make the Israelis comfortable? How can we make the occupation feel all cozy for them, right? So we need the token Palestinians. We need the good ones, the obedient ones, the ones who will listen, who will play ball, who will not do, the things that upset the status quo. And so they're talking about the PA as being the alternative, but this is delusional. In one way, they are also talking about the PA as if it only means the current leadership of the PA, which is also phenomenal in its disconnect from reality. The PA as a governing structure, we can call it whatever we want. The Palestinian governing structure will be there because the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. We're going to need a governing system, a political system, whatever we end up calling it. Will this status quo of political leaders survive this genocide? I would say absolutely not. They are on political life support because it's convenient right now. And because I don't think that the egg hunting for alternatives has concluded in the West. And I'm not sure that they're going to find viable alternatives because their criteria is wrong. I think Hamas has matured politically to understand that it cannot replace Fatah and the PLO. And so it wants in a way that also honors its status and share of Palestinian public opinion. But that requires dialogue, right? Inter-Palestinian dialogue. We need to actually sit down on the table and talk about these things and solve them and resolve them in a way that works for us before we talk to the world. And that is not happening, which is why I think that this whole talk about the day after is a way to prolong this war, right? Not to actually look and prepare for the day after, but to actually make this last as long as possible. Because the way they're going about it is predetermined for failure. And I think we have to own up to our own shortcomings as a society that is so vibrant and so vocal and so on. that we haven't been able to kind of put everybody in their place. In a way, we've been watching these players do to themselves and to us all of that without kind of putting the brakes, and that needs organization. I'm hoping that this genocide will kind of motivate a completely different exercise of reimagining, of reformulation of the national movement that is required, and without which I don't think we can move forward past the war.
Thanks, Nour. I wanna draw you out a little bit more on this point on where we go from here, and how do Palestinians go about revamping their political institutions and their leadership. And I want to make a distinction between, in the West, the focus, and the US and to a lesser extent the Israelis are focused on the question of governance, right? Governance and security. Whereas what I hear from Palestinians more often is, well, what about leadership? Political leadership requires, governance is one function, but you need a leadership with a vision that is representative, that has legitimacy, and so forth. And that's what's missing from the discussion. But how do you get that kind of leadership? How do you get a legitimate leadership in place? What mechanisms do you put in place? One way is through elections. And that, maybe before October 7th was a realistic expectation. But even elections has its limitations because it's focused on one of the constituencies of Palestinians, those in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, to the exclusion of the rest, right?
Right.
So how do you rebuild a Palestinian national consensus of some kind? Are elections the way to do that? Are elections feasible at all? And if not, then what other mechanisms do you have? Or do you simply wait until Mahmoud Abbas dies, and then it will take care of itself through various succession processes in the PA or the PLO? How do Palestinians establish this leadership that is legitimate?
Well, one I think of the troubling things that we're facing as Palestinians is the fact that all our institutions have been degraded. So where, when Yasser Arafat was killed or passed, we had institutions that could actually have a conversation, even though Hamas and Islamic Jihad were outside of it, but there was still that culture of discussion, of figuring out what to do. And there was a respect that, you needed to have the transition, you needed to have consultations, there were elections as ordered by law in the PA, and there was, a transition into PLO leadership. All of that is gone. All of that has been undermined. We don't have a legislative council of the PA. The PLO institutions are, they were a skeleton, and now I don't know what we can call them, how we can qualify them. People under genocide whose sole and legitimate representative hasn't convened in 7 months, except once or twice. Well, it's one way to kind of, kill yourself and bury yourself, is to take conscious and deliberate actions to be, outside of the circle of action. And so that is a crisis, because in a way, I think Palestinians who are politically active don't want to lose the PLO as a political entity that is recognized in the world. And on the other, there is an understanding that the PLO needs to be reimagined and rebuilt, and not just in terms of people and members and factions, but in terms of agenda, in terms of the charter, in terms of where do we go from here and how do we talk to the world, instead of just responding to pressure and responding to diktats. There have been several initiatives And I think they were very important initiatives. Now, with the war raging, it's more difficult to talk about these things, partly because also the war has not resolved. So the balance of power, is not conclusively known yet, even though I think we can all safely say that Hamas will demand a far bigger chair at the table after this. But again, it will fall on Palestinian, I think, figures, people, independents, to kind of dust all that, take off all of that dust that has been accumulating, where civil society and independents have had a role in everything except politics, and I think that needs to change in order for a different conversation to be had and to be forced upon the leaders. But I don't think that is possible in vis-a-vis Fatah under the current leadership. I think there is a very painful rebirth that awaits Fatah if it wants to continue to be an important player in Palestinian politics, as it will be, or it has always been, despite all of its troubles, because of its history and its size, and because it's a political jellyfish and it doesn't really require ideological commitments from its member. It's a movement, and so it in many ways it's more familiar, right, to ordinary Palestinians. It's just a movement that wants to liberate the homeland. So yeah, I think we will have to, in many ways, wait, but also continue to have conversations that build momentum towards something more meaningful that is not led by conventional actors. Because this reconciliation, going to Beijing and going to Moscow, why do we need to go to Moscow or Beijing to figure out what we want as Palestinians? It's ridiculous. And that's why it won't work. And that's why the government, also going back to Lara's question, the whole political system has made itself irrelevant. Right now, the house is on fire and they're thinking about, whether the upholstery makes sense or the colors match. It's a bizarre conversation. And you have nobody representing that government on the border in Rafah or inside in the Gaza Strip.
So we call that the rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic approach to politics. Mouin, I want to bring you in here, and I know you have something you want to add. I'm going to ask you a question, then feel free to add it into your answer here. And this is relevant to the discussion we're having here about what Palestinian internal governance looks like, how Palestinians view their future and leadership, and how you get there. In the meantime, people are looking already at quote unquote post-war Gaza, whatever that means. And there's clearly this huge gap in the vision as laid out by Israeli leaders on the one hand, and the international community on the other, where you have, the Biden administration's talking about, no permanent reoccupation of Gaza. Again, whatever they mean by that, it seems to be a very flexible idea, and calling for the return to the PA. You have the government of Israel, which has a vision of post-war Gaza that basically sees the Israeli army in place indefinitely in some form of occupation, some form of control, and explicitly no return of the PA. And then you've got Abbas, who initially pledged to never return to Gaza, quote, on the backs of Israeli tanks. And now it actually looks like that is very much on the table. And all of that figures into this question of what does Palestinian ruling leadership governance look like in the future? And then on top of that, you've got this idea of international players, Arab states, and what their role might be. And that role is not merely about dealing with the humanitarian situation and restabilization of Gaza, but it actually fits into an Arab role in deciding what Palestinian governance in future looks like. So can you opine on all of that and whatever else you wanted to bring into this round?
Sure. Thank you, Lara. And I listened to both Nour and Abdelhadi's points they raise with great interest. And if I could just add a few details to what both of them offered. The first is, I think, particularly during the past decade, there's been a growing distinction between the Palestinian Authority on the one hand and the Fatah movement, or whatever remains of it, on the other. I think under Arafat, they were very closely aligned. I think Abbas has sought to create a Palestinian Authority that is independent of Fatah in certain respects. And that this also, I think, creates as yet unfulfilled opportunities for Fatah to reinvent itself independently, or at least autonomously, of the Palestinian Authority. The second is that I would say that Hamas's loss, or any loss by Hamas in the Gaza Strip in terms of popularity or institutional power or whatever, does not necessarily translate into the Palestinian Authority's gain. The Palestinian Authority is also detested by many Gazans who detest Hamas because of the pernicious role it has played in the blockade of the Gaza Strip. And so one can be opposed to Hamas and be at least as opposed to the Palestinian Authority. And I think it's important to bear in mind that we're not dealing with an either or situation here. The third is regarding the reconstruction of the Palestinian movement. I'm making a point of not using the word reconciliation out of respect for Nour, but I have for many years felt that the departure of Abbas from the political scene is a prerequisite and a precondition for any Palestinian future. Yes, there are people in Hamas who are deeply invested in the schism, just as there are people in Fatah who are deeply invested in the schism. There are people within both of these movements who will do their best to prevent any rebuilding of a genuinely national movement for their own factional reasons. But at the end of the day, there is one person who has had the power to systematically obstruct any progress and has used it, and that is Mahmoud Abbas. So even when his own Fatah movement has participated in schemes to reduce tensions or work out new structures with Hamas, he has systematically sabotaged and undermined them. And I've for years felt as long as he's there, no progress, full stop. Finally, I don't think elections are a solution. I won't get into the reasons here, but there are many. I don't think these kinds of disputes can be settled by an election. Much more needs to happen before you have an election, if you indeed should have election. And I think under the current circumstances of Palestinian existence, what is really required is power sharing, where all the main forces are able to participate in decision-making, rather than key forces monopolizing decisions because they won elections, and key forces being excluded from decision-making because they lost the elections by 1 or 2 or 5%. Now, that out of the way, I'll turn to your question. It's as you noted, it's a difficult question to answer before the proverbial dust has settled. But if my previous assessment that Hamas will continue to play a prominent role is correct, then I think it follows that there can be no role for either the Palestinian Authority or foreign parties, whether Arab or Western, without the consent of Hamas and without coordination with it. And I think that kind of coordination is possible, but won't happen because you have certain key parties, the United States most prominently among them, who has taken an ideological position of refusing not only any engagement with Hamas, but refusing the engagement of others with Hamas, and accepting governance and reconstruction and other structures only if they exclude Hamas a priori. And so the point I would make here is that it's my assessment that Hamas will maintain the wherewithal to oppose any structures that seek to be designed to exclude it and to weaken it. I mean, any political movement would do that. You could argue they'd be fools to do otherwise. Why would they participate in their own suicide? So that's my first point. The second point I would make is regarding the role of Arab states. I think it's a little more complex. One thing that distinguishes Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is that Hamas does not have any formal Arab legitimacy, the way that the PLO and the Palestinian Authority do. Its relations with Qatar, for example, notwithstanding. And I think Hamas, as a matter of principle, would be prepared to consider the involvement of Arab states if this was within a framework that gave it greater regional legitimacy and gave it an ability to continue playing an effective role within the Gaza Strip. Whether that can or will happen is, I think, remains very much an open question. And finally, I think these Arab states, for the most part, will be very hesitant to throw good money after bad, particularly where it seems that the political ceiling for the Biden administration is a return to the Oslo process until kingdom come. And I suspect that these Arab states will be seeking credible guarantees from the Americans and the Europeans that their involvement is part, as some of them have already stated, is part of an irreversible process towards an end to Israeli occupation. And they will be doing so for a number of reasons, not least of which is that their involvement in the Gaza Strip being seen by their own domestic public opinion as picking up the pieces on behalf of Israel and the United States could place them in real jeopardy unless they achieve such guarantees. Thank you.
Thanks, Mouin. Abdelhadi, I want to come back to you, and we're just about out of time, so I'm afraid you'll have the last word. I want to ask for you to comment on anything that has been raised about the future of the PA and the PLO, but I want to zoom in specifically on the future of Gaza, since this is an issue that you've looked at closely and that you know quite a lot about. When we talk about reconstruction in Gaza, people throw around that word when the reality is that we're really looking at tens and tens of billions of dollars, and the estimates keep going up for what it will take to rebuild Gaza, both in terms of resources but also in terms of time. I've seen some estimates say that it will take 80 years just to bring Gaza back to where it was before October 7th. But we know the number that's being thrown around is something like $40 billion. And I think most of that is just to rebuild housing. And we're talking about 80,000 homes that have been completely destroyed and another almost 400,000 that have been damaged. What does Gaza reconstruction look like? Is it even possible to imagine a reconstructed Gaza? And who or what is governing Gaza in the meantime? I mean, the Israeli army and political leadership seem to be cultivating local forces like, I don't know, business leaders, local notables, or warlords. What does future governance in Gaza look like?
Well, this is a question need a lot of discussion, but let me take it from two perspectives. One, as a Palestinian from Gaza who have lived there, but also have been following the news and writing about the Gaza Strip, but also as a researcher who have researched the post-conflict reconstruction of Beirut, of Sarajevo and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in Rwanda as well. And I think from personal perspective, nobody wants Gaza. Not the Palestinian Authority, neither Egypt, neither Israel, nor the Arab states. They wanted some influence in the Gaza Strip, but they don't want that. Even Abbas himself and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah see Gaza and Gaza as a burden on them. So they prefer not to take it back or to help in the reconstruction if that is not beneficial to them at the long and short term. Beneficial, I mean financially, not politically, because politically they don't care about it. And if we wanted to go back since 1994 from Shirkat al-Bahar until today, you will have a lot of series of things from Gaza Strip, how the Palestinian Authority benefited financially, the figures from this. So what I see here is also these figures. Actually, I read a few reports from this, even the UN report. These are done by commercial, business-oriented think tanks, consultants, who have nothing to do in Gaza. Some of them have interviewed me because they just didn't know what is happening in Gaza and how the houses in Gaza look like. Consultants by the UN, they paid maybe thousands of dollars to do these kind of prognosis of Gaza destruction and post reconstruction. So here I'm skeptical about the amount of money and the time needed to reconstruct Gaza. They have said about the Gaza in 2014 the same, but Gazans have rebuilt the infrastructure of Gaza in just 2 years in an amazing way. They had developed business, but the problem here is the political will. If there is a political will to reconstruct Gaza, Gaza can be reconstructed in 5 years. And if the borders opens. So here is, we don't have the political will of the Palestinian Authority, of the Arab states, and Israel, of course, to reconstruct Gaza. Once we do that, Gaza is the home of 50%, 50% of the population are youth. They are educated. There is a great labor force in Gaza. So there is a possibility to reconstruct Gaza by Gazans, if there is a political will again. But here is one point I just wanted to comment about, which is related to the post-conflict reconstruction, because here what I see in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Lebanon, the focus was always on infrastructures, but not on the humans. And that's the important point, that we needed to focus on rebuilding the Palestinian human of Gaza education capacity. We are talking about 250 professors have been killed. We are talking about the most of the activists who opposed Fatah and opposed Hamas have left or killed. Now you have a Gaza empty space with no intellectual capacity there. So that's the point here. How we reconstruct Gaza brains, Gaza human capacity and human capital before talking about the building infrastructure and the streets. And it reminded me of, that who is the representative of youth in the Palestinian Central Council? Do you know anybody? Do you know him? His name is Ibrahim Khresha, 68 years old. He is still young, by the way. He is still young. So he is. So this is give you that about this. This is a comment here, and that's why reconstruction must include strengthen political participation of two important sectors in the Gaza Strip: women and youth. Without this, as if we have done nothing. And that's, of course, the agenda should be from bottom up, from the Gazans themselves. And when it comes to this reconstruction. And last point here is about the who can govern Gaza. There are a few scenarios that have been Israel trying to do in the last 3-4 months. They have done a few scenarios, and sometimes they went up to the surface and sometimes down. One, they tried with the tribes. They brought head of tribes of influential tribes like Dogmosh, Shhebar, Al-Kafarna in northern Gaza. Everybody refused. They said they met in Al-Shifa hospital. They refused. They said, we can't. Some individuals accepted. And then after a few weeks, they said, no, we can't do this. We don't continue. So the idea is the local tribes, tribal forces, extended families, influential families to control the Gaza Strip in coordination with Al-Munassiq. It doesn't work. It's not. It worked with some international organizations to ask for protection, paid protection by those families when they go into the North Gaza, but not to deliver services and stuff like this. The second scenario was businessmen, which they have succeeded in getting aid into the Gaza Strip. There are some business influentials who have been also, before 7 October, have links and talks with the Israeli business counterparts and the Israeli army and Munassiq. They have control over the now Kerem Shalom, the Kerem Abu Salim. But who work with them? Mostly are criminal Palestinians. So this is what the only way that Israel could deliver aid into the Gaza, because they said only those we allow in to take the aid. So this model for Israel, it could be perfect for them, but it's not going to work for the Palestinians. The third scenario is allowing Fatah, or I don't want to say Fatah because Fatah, they don't want this to happen in the Gaza Strip and also in the majority in the West Bank, is the Palestinian intelligence agency to let some of its officers from the Gaza Strip to take over certain area by a small scales areas in Gaza Strip. They started with Rafah. They didn't succeed. Then they went to Al Zaytun area in Gaza Strip. They didn't succeed. They went to Jaddaliya. They didn't succeed. They let them come with the aid envoy a few times. Israel killed 2 of them, and then Hamas said to them, no, we are not going to allow this. The Palestinians in Gaza, they started to look at them with disgust. Like, you are coming here. How come you agree to do this? Yeah. So here, what I see here is exactly what Mouin said. We needed a power sharing in terms of not power sharing in the constitutionalism in the same way of by Lebanon or Lebanonization, or even like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because we are not yet liberated. Palestine is not liberated. The Palestinians are not liberated. You cannot, because if you want to act as a state, as an authority, then you cannot liberate. But you cannot, because unless you act as mix between, or as a Khmer revolutionary liberation movement, and then share exactly like al-Haraka al-Wataniya in the first Intifada, al-Qiyada al-Muwahhada. And that's exactly what we want. Al-Qiyada al-Muwahhada, which can take these collective decisions that represent every Palestinian and can govern the Gaza Strip through committees, technocratic committees in the Gaza Strip. And that's the only way, I think, and the only visible way that could succeed.
All right, so I'm sorry, we're going to have to end it there. We've gone a little bit over. This is such a rich discussion. I actually feel like we need to have an entirely separate discussion on a number of these topics that we surfaced today, and I hope we can call upon you all in the future, maybe for some further conversations. But we're going to have to end it here today. On behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank our participants, Abdelhadi, Nour, and Mouin, for this remarkable, powerful, and very timely discussion. And thanks to all who joined us for this webinar and for the past webinars in this series. We so much appreciate your participation, your questions. We hope you enjoyed today's session. And as we noted at the beginning, this is the final session in this year's briefing series, the Gaza Catastrophe, a private briefing series for the 118th Congress. As a reminder, now that the series is complete, we will be making the whole series public. So please do feel free to share this with your colleagues, both on and off the Hill. And finally, on behalf of FMEP and MEI, it's been a pleasure to jointly present and moderate this series with Khaled Al-Gindi, and to honor to host so many great panelists. We look forward to doing this and seeing many of you again in 2025. So thank you.